Thanks for inviting me back, guys. It's really nice to be here again. Last time I came and I talked about why words matter, and it was a talk that covered my obsession with poetry from an early age, Donald Trump's weird ramblings, and the importance of language in our rapidly evolving world where we're bombarded with information constantly. Today we're going to talk about the importance of words and pictures working together. So I've invited my partner, Jonathan, because he's a graphic designer, and we're going to talk about the marriage of words and pictures. So yeah, thanks for having us.
So we thought we'd start with what our story is, just to, I guess, set the scene so that it gives it some context. So we've been working together for, working in design. I've been doing it for 20 years. Kendra's been doing it for, what is it now? 15. And for the past 2 years, I've been working from home. And this is pretty much how we work. This is pretty much how my parents think we work. So Kendra's hammering out words and I make pretty pictures.
I should just add that we moved from London to Bristol, like a cliche, 2 years ago, and which was a bit bonkers in that Jonathan's studio was in London in Smithfield Market, and we were like, we can make this work. We'll just commute when we need to, and it was a little bit mad, but it was a lifestyle choice, hence why we suddenly found ourselves sitting next to each other in our spare room, and the issue of words and pictures came to the fore, really, because we started to talk a lot about what we do. And this talk has fallen out of those conversations, really.
So I had an agency in London for 12 years, and before that I'd worked at various agencies of different sizes. And the one thing that always frustrated me was that more often than not, words ended up being something that got thought about later. When I first started work, I worked in Scotland in Edinburgh coming from university, and when I first started work there, it was almost a team like an ad agency. You would be a creative with a copywriter that you worked with, and they were the account manager as well. So there were always words that were kind of the starting point, whereas in general, it's not like that. More often than not, it's about how things look, and then what the words kind of almost are secondary to it. So we're not married. Kendra has been having taken artistic license of the title. So we basically live in sin, and we've got 2 kids who like to wear pants on their heads a lot and get dressed up. And when we first went and met Kendra's gran, Grace, to tell her that we were going to have kids, she was a very sweet little old lady. She explained to us that there was going to be a word for our children, and this is kind of sums up what this is all about. It's about the power of words and a picture, and how those words can define what that picture means.
And change how it feels.
So we met working at an agency in London called Tango.
Where we met Alex.
Yeah.
Who was actually my boss.
And we worked on the Nike account, and for them, they understood the power of words, and the way that they spoke about their products was amazing. And they could make the most mundane of things sound like they could make you into a winner. So a pair of socks would get you over the winning line, the line faster than anyone else.
Called foot gloves, though.
Yeah, they would always do it in a very Nike way, and the way that they kind of taught you about the way that they should speak was that they sent you, there was a thing called the Ekin program where you learnt about Nike back to front, and at the core of how they spoke was this mantra that they were never about fashion, they were always about performance, and that the way that you spoke about the products was so important, and it kind of made you realise that largely it's smoke and mirrors. They were selling products that were no different to anybody else's, but they made them, they elevated them to a different level and a different price point by the way that they spoke about them.
So people often ask us what we do, and particularly our parents' generation, it's quite difficult to explain and make it sound worthwhile. Well, not worthwhile, but actually like it's important, really, because it sounds just really fun, I think. So I write, but I do a lot of thinking, and that thinking is the brand strategy. I work with strategists a lot to develop creative briefs and to talk to audiences and do research to create the foundations of a design project. But really what we do is captured in this statement. We tell brand stories, and a brand can be an individual, an organisation, a charity, a cafe, anything, a product. We help those businesses to tell a story. And so today we wanted to talk about storytelling, really, and the importance of storytelling in a world where we are just bombarded with information and content every single day. So what is a brand? It's a personality, it's a feeling, and it's an experience. It's a promise captured in words, pictures, and experience, but it's so many different nuances. It's like a person in a way, and our job is to look at the values, the personality, and the proposition of that brand and bring it to life using, for us, words and pictures, but also experiences are more and more important, and UX, and actual physical, tangible experiences of a world that's created around this product or entity.
So somebody like Patagonia, they promise to make the best outdoor clothing with the least amount of harm to the planet. Or Nike will be promising to make you the best you can be. And it's those promises that run through everything which they do, from the product that they make to the way that they talk to you and the way that you interact with that brand.
So tell your story well, and the world will listen. It's a cliched thing to say, but it's really true. And what I've learned, particularly over the past 2 years, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, but the past 2 years have really made me appreciate the value of good storytelling. And we believe that comes out of the partnership between the writer, the visual and the verbal, the writer and the designer. So a big part of my job, or both of our jobs, is connecting with audience, understanding who we're talking to, what we want them to think, feel and do when they interact with our product, our charity, our brand.
You kind of have to get into the shoe. You have to get into the tiny little details, ask endless questions, and pick everything to pieces to completely understand who it is they're going to be talking to know how best to actually speak to them.
I think, for me, emotional resonance and empathy is the most important part of what we do, and this is something we share in terms of it's a prerequisite to doing the job well. It really is, and that empathy for who you're talking to, what their life is like, how you want them to respond, what you want them to do when they interact with your communication, is absolutely paramount. And we talk a lot about the audience that we're working for and who they are and what their experience of the world is, particularly today.
It's also quite easy to bring along kind of preconceived ideas of what a product or a brand is, and you have to put that aside and get into, stop being yourself in a way and step into the customer's shoes to understand how best to actually speak to them.
So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I increasingly do is work with strategy teams in-house for big agencies, both here and in London, to look at the thinking. So I work on qualitative research, I might do an online survey, I've just done that recently with an audience, to get under the skin of who I'm talking to And this thinking, this strategy, people use the word strategy, it's a big word, but this is about good thinking. And the designer and the writer come at it from this same point of view. The thinking is paramount. And there is no better process than when the thinking is on the same page and the two people are working together to formulate a brief. And that brief needs to feed everything the creative does. And the words within that brief are the strategic words that then come to life through the design.
And the brief ends up being the kind of starting point for the story that we're going to tell. And the ad industry...
Just to add, sorry.
That's right.
To interrupt, just to say that we've been told stories since we were little. You know, Ladybird books told us stories using words and pictures. And stories have a structure. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's usually high points and low points. There's a protagonist. And that structure we're all used to from a really early age. We understand what stories do. We're used to the visual and the verbal working hand in hand. In the lack of verbal, our imagination takes over. If there aren't any words, we make it up. But if there are words, we're planting thoughts in people's heads. We're getting to think in a certain way and getting them to take a certain direction.
So the ad industry always kind of knew about the power of storytelling, and they always worked in the way that I did when I was first in Scotland, where there was always a copywriter and a creative in a team. And there would be an idea, but more often than not, the first thing that actually came out of that idea would be a written treatment. And it was then the pictures were then added into the written treatment to actually amplify the idea behind it. And so they always understood the power of words. It was never a secondary thing that came along. And so whether it be the way that they totally reinvented the way that Volkswagen spoke about cars. So cars up until then looked like a car should, and then suddenly Volkswagen decided to turn it on its head and make this ugly thing that, you know, to start off with, people didn't like. And they, rather than focusing on sort of it being faster, it being sleeker, they completely turned the way they spoke about the product on its head by talking about, I think at one point they referred to it as a lemon, which in car terms was that was a negative, but they saw it as being a positive because it referenced in a way the shape of the actual car itself. But they decided to talk about living below your means, about actually, rather than worrying about how you're going to get there, just enjoy it because you're not worried about how much this thing's cost. Apple completely reinvented the way they talk about their products. They up until then, they were grey boxes that really actually didn't even get any advertising. It was something that you didn't bother advertising because it wasn't seen as being, an aspirational product. They would talk about, rather than talking about what the product did, they talk about why you should want it. The fact that if you've got one of these products, you're going to look cool. Certainly cooler than the guy with the beige box next to you. Nike, as I said, copy is at the core of what they do, and the only thing that stays the same with Nike is their logo. Everything else they changed for whoever they're speaking to and what they're talking about. They reinvent themselves constantly. They're almost like Madonna. So they will always just work with, they'll be driven by a statement. It's very simple communication, but it's always very, very powerful.
And we do go on about it because we met working for this brand, and it taught us both a lot. But what they do really well is kind of bridge the gap between the everyday person and the amazing athlete. There is this sense, and this is more in recent years actually with their advertising, but there is a sense that you can achieve anything, whoever you are, you can be a champion within your own parameters. And whatever you think of them, and they are really criticised, just like Apple, anyone that does really well is, but the language is absolutely fundamental, and the fact that this is handwritten, and just little small aspects of this creative that that really connect with human beings on an emotional level. It's that resonance that I mentioned earlier, the emotional resonance.
So one of the things we were trying to think about ads that we'd actually remembered, and they're actually, now I think the ad world's, it's quite difficult, because previously you would interact with communication largely like an ad. It would be in a magazine, or as you walk down the street, you would be seeing things that spoke to you as you walk down the street, whether it be a 48 sheet or whatever. But because there wasn't as much, they had more chance of making impact. Whereas now you're being constantly bombarded by information, and there's just a lot of noise, and so actually standing out becomes far more difficult. So we kind of talked about the ads that stuck with us, and it ended up being one that was from a long time ago, just because it kind of defined how certainly TV ads could actually be, and that they could actually become almost like a mini film. They really it was a story, it was a self-contained mini story.
He waits. That's what he does. And I'll tell you what, tick followed tock, followed tick, followed tock, followed tick. Ahab says, I don't care who you are, here's to your dream. The old sailors return to the bar. Here's to you, Ahab! And the fat drummer hit the beat with all his heart. Here's to waiting.
I think what I loved about that advert, which I still love, is that there is a moment of silence where the words disappear. And it's so poetic, the language. I think it's taken from a piece of old literature. I was reading about it. But it's the language and the visual and the verbal together are so incredibly perfect. The weaving of that story is just beautiful. And then there's this moment where the words stop, and you're so in that moment with those people. You know what they're feeling. You're so connected. And the fact that it's Guinness, you know it's going to refresh you. You're going to buy that.
So what the ad world always knew was that what you say is as important as how you look.
But sorry, just to...
You go.
My experience, we had planned this, but we're going to interrupt each other, just like people do in a relationship. But I think my experience in design, so back in 2001 when I started as an account exec in a design agency, and I met Jonathan, words were just not very important. They were an afterthought. Just bung something in, maybe in Latin. We'll think about it later. It's someone else's problem. We'll deal with it later on down the line. And I think this kind of lack of priority to something so important really stuck with me. And I love words. I'm passionate about them. I wrote poems from an early age, which I told you last time I came. And this has really changed. And today, I often work with the strategist at the very beginning of a project to look at the language of the brief that then feeds into the creative's head and the ideas that come out of his head. So that strategic language becomes fundamental to the creative campaign or the creative concept. And there are many brands that there are words associated with brands. So McDonald's, the word happy, which is ironic. There are lots of brands. There's kind of Land Rover that's more sophisticated. There are words that we could brainstorm about what words we'd associate with each company. So I think words are far more important now than they ever used to be.
So I think what's sitting next to each other for 2 years, and often not necessarily even working together on projects, I'd be Kendra would be banging her head against the desk because something was frustrating about a designer that she was working with or a project that she was working with, and that because words hadn't been considered early enough that they were brought in right at the last minute. And often by then the kind of horse had bolted, it was too late. The client had started expecting a language, but the language didn't really work. Often what happens with a designer is they'll kind of come up with a brilliant idea that works for one touch point, but then when you try to run it across everything, that's when it starts to stumble. But if you actually work together from the very beginning, you can really just great things can really happen with the communication. So you can make the complex simple. We can make the mundane interesting. I've never enjoyed going to the gym. And you can make the everyday sexy. So
this is from the M&S food adverts, which I just love what they've done. The voiceover, all of it, it's hilarious. Just the fact that they've made a boiled egg.
It's food porn.
Or is that a Scotch egg?
It's a Scotch egg.
It's the most unsexy piece of food in existence. Really amazing, just through words and voice. The voice is really important in that advertising.
So we thought we'd show you some stories that we've had the good luck to tell, the opportunity, I guess, and we've had the chance to work with some lovely clients in the past. So this was for a client that I worked with who were a few years ago were launching a very, very secure instant messaging app before everyone started panicking about security of communication, and they'd had all of their servers in Switzerland, and the reason why they did that was because written into the constitution is a law which says that nobody can access data, so the FBI, CIA, whoever can't come and kick down the doors and start demanding that they can access people's information. And part of the brief, underlined and highlighted, was just don't make us Swiss because they're really boring. And we went away and scratched our heads. And sometimes when you get a brief, you get a gut feeling that there is actually only really one answer, and though clients expect three. But my view is only give them the ones that are actually any good. So we went away, and for us, actually being Swiss was the core of their brand. It was what made them different to everybody else. They were the most secure instant messaging app that you could use. So they were Swiss and they were secretive, and they became Swisper. And the lovely bit about what we do is often not just the kind of writing the body copy and the headlines, it's the naming part of it. It's a bit like naming a child. It's one of the most difficult but fun things, and often when you come up with a name, particularly when you're working with smaller companies, they find it so difficult to kind of commit to it because they're worried that people will question what that name means or why you've called it. My view is that, you know, when you're naming a child, you're always worried about what people might think about it, but because of the name. But if you come up and say, well, this is my newborn baby Alan, they won't question, they'll just go, that's Alan, and they just accept it. It's about what you then go on from, what that person then goes on to do after that. So we renamed it Swisper. And with anything Swiss, you kind of know what it's going to look like because it's going to be set in Helvetica and there's going to be a Red Cross involved. And part of this app was that you could send messages to people, and then if you happen to send a photograph of your bum to somebody and you wanted to delete it or you regretted it, you could delete it off their phone. So you could set a bomb that would delete it. So the Swiss cross went through 45 degrees and became the delete cross. So we created the way that they spoke. They'd originally been a very business to business kind of communication, hence the security. and then they realised that it could become far more consumer friendly. So this was the kind of consumer takedown of it, and it was all about very quickly and simply being able to communicate how this worked, and then that ran across all of the user interface.
This project for me was the client is the Internet Society. The Internet Society are probably an entity you've never heard of. They're a charity or an NGO who work with the UN. Their remit is to preserve the foundations that the internet were created on and to enable the internet to evolve sustainably and for the better of humanity. They're an amazing group of people. They work in chapters in every country in the world. It's vast. They speak like robots. They are technical people, and copywriting was so needed. So I worked with moving brands who brought me in to look at the tone of voice and the language, and this was an exercise in simplifying a very complex world of dots and beeps. It really was inaccessible to you or I. So this was a film we made, and the words came from me. At the very beginning was then used across all of the campaign material. This was some posters for an event. These posters were at JFK in New York at the airport because there was a big UN conference on the internet, and this issue of enabling it to evolve in a safe and sustainable way. But clearly this is a thing that is bigger than us in a way. It feels like a snowball that's gathered pace, and for me as a parent certainly it feels kind of out of control. And so it was really interesting working with an organisation that wanted to evolve and be a positive thing, but also the need to control aspects of it. And I went over to Washington and ran a workshop with all of the different chapters that flew in from different places on how they could communicate in a way that would engage people and make them feel something. And so this language is a product of that mission, really.
This next project, this was for, these guys are based in Bristol, and they are 4 30-year-old guys with doctorates in fluid dynamics, and they had, they're painfully clever, and it's one of the most difficult projects to work on to actually understand what they do. So they have come up with an algorithm which can take data that's readily available from people like NASA, and they've been able to map the globe down a 30 centimetres square, and they can predict anywhere within the world with an incredibly high accuracy where will flood. So they originally came out of university with a doctorate and went, right, what we're going to do with this. And a lot of the guys that they went to studied with ended up going and working for insurance companies, because the insurance companies want to know where is going to flood. And so they decided, well, let's create the best system in the world and sell the data to these insurance companies. So they were doing that quite happily, and they could talk to the guys in the insurance companies because they were employing scientists, so they could talk their tech speak. But they realised that there was also a value in this data for a much bigger audience, who were people like Microsoft, who ended up being one of their first major clients, or anyone who was going to build a facility and basically didn't want to get it wet. So anyone in the tech industry, they were wanting to speak to, but they couldn't talk to them very easily because they could only talk about it in the context of fluid dynamics and things like that. And we had to get them to, well, even just speaking to us, we kept on saying, right, talk to us like you're talking to a cat, because we don't have a clue what you're talking about. And at that point they were called SSBN, and we needed to make them much more consumer friendly. So we, again, it was one of those ones where we were going to do a renaming, and we had an idea and just said, well, listen, we like this name. If you like it, you can have it for free. Otherwise, we're going to have to charge you for the process of going anywhere else. And that usually focuses the client's mind and makes them go for the free route. But we renamed them Fathom because it's a depth of water, and it's about solving really complex problems. And we created a much more user-friendly, I guess, but more customer-facing way of talking. It was all based around big facts, benefits that enable people to quickly understand how their services could benefit their business. And this rolled out across all of their communication. So whilst the insurance companies could talk to them in the techie way, and they could see that, whereas they used to do all of their risk assessment based on a postcode which covered a massive area, now they could look at whether that side of the street, house on that side of the street, would flood in comparison to that side of the street. But the guys who didn't understand all the data, they could start to work out where they were going to build their facility, or they could speak to government organisations about disaster relief. They could predict where there was going to be, if there was going to be a flood in the next 50 years, what was the quickest route to evacuate people from that place to a place of safety. And it just changed it, turned it on its head, the way that they went from being people who they were doing it almost as a hobby, and then they had to make it into a business, and they had to start treating the way that they spoke as a business.
I don't know if any of you are familiar with Maggie's, the cancer charity. This project is really close to my own heart, and a real honour to work on. This was through an agency in Bristol called Edo, who do UX design and work for charities mainly, who are absolutely brilliant at creating experiences for charities. Maggie's is a cancer charity. They provide incredible therapeutic spaces and buildings within the grounds of oncology hospitals for patients, once they've had their treatment, to go and just be, and to do or be whatever they need. So this is the centre in Aberdeen, and architects designed these buildings pro bono, free of charge. This was, I think, Frank Gehry. Each building is designed around a one-page brief, and that brief specifies that they have to have certain aspects within the building, like a central atrium with a table for everybody to sit around. But every building is very different, and they are incredible. They show the power of a designed space. The details are amazing. There are little windows where people can sit and look at greenery. They really do take you away from something really awful that you're experiencing. And these spaces feel very strongly in a kind of, they feel very soft, they feel very welcoming, they're very gentle, they're very non-intrusive, and the charity wanted their language and their communication to reflect the experience of going into this building, which was a really difficult thing to do. So I worked with Pentagram Design in London, who did the rebrand, which was also pro bono, I think, and this sort of handwritten Maggie's is very gentle, very human, very soft. And they started out with this notional language, really, a place that feels like home. because these centres are designed to contradict the clinical oncology department, the cold, lacking in warmth, the lack of humanity in those places, the quick service you get in a hospital. And my job was to develop a tone of voice, a formal tone of voice, that would capture the feeling of being inside these spaces that provide these patients with so much. So first of all, I did an online survey with cancer patients, and I asked them what they wanted to hear, what words they hated, how they felt about the language of cancer. It was really powerful, and the feedback was amazing. I wanted to know what had been said to them that had stayed with them, what had been said to them that upset them. And my language was taken from their feedback, really. So we just have this really soft, just come in. So if you go to a Maggie Centre and you walk in, somebody will come to you in a really not in your face way and just say, do you need anything? And you might say, oh, I need to sleep, or I need a massage, I need yoga, whatever you need, it's there. So this copywriting was really capturing that feeling. It's really recessive, but I wanted it to be powerful for that. It's almost the opposite of marketing.
This was a client I would have loved to have renamed, but it wasn't an opportunity. There wasn't a chance there. So this is the Global Partnership of Forest Landscape Restoration, which ended up being quite a mouthful. And they're an NGO who they're not. I guess they're not an environment. They are an environmental NGO, but they are. They're not saving trees for the sake of saving trees. They're doing it for communities. They're trying to re-educate communities that rather than chopping down trees for a quick buck and planting palm trees for palm oil, they are trying to educate them that if you actually maintain your forest and the landscape around you, that you can actually benefit from it just as much, whether it be through tourism or using the materials within the forest to make things that they can then sell. Often they're going into very isolated communities, and it's all been done by loads of different charities all around the world that are kind of under this umbrella organisation. And they all have a different idea of what it is that they do, and so they never really spoke with a common voice. And so we were given mountains and mountains of case studies that were very dry and dull, and had to go through everything and try to get to the core of what it is that they actually do. And that was where this positioning of ideas transform landscapes came from. Because that's effectively, it kind of summed up everything that all of these guys do. And whenever you've got loads of stakeholders involved, it's always a nightmare because everyone's got a different view on it. But it became this one thing that everyone could understand. It was an easy to communicate concept. Often these guys were scientists, and they were rubbish at actually saying what they did. So we had to, more often than not, they were talking to governments about getting funding to then go out and do the work that they do. And so they were more often than not talking to people who didn't have a science background. So it was a case of taking what they did and making it far more easy to understand. And we had the luxury of having access to some amazing photography archives from the World Wildlife Fund and loads of other charities. And so once the text and the kind of way that we were going to talk was sorted, it was just a case of going hunting for amazing pictures.
The last project I've shown as an example was recent and local. I don't know if you know Happy Bird on White Ladies Road in Bristol. This was one of those projects that I was brought in at the end. The words were an afterthought. The language of the visual language existed. So my job was to understand it, interpret it, and to come up with some copy around good middle-class fried chicken, to put it bluntly. So this was the guy who founded Domino's Pizza, who was feeling pretty guilty about the rubbish food he put out into the world, and this was his making amends. So they have low-density farms in the Yorkshire Dales. The birds are plump and happy, and
feed them on herbs.
And this is the whole premise of this fried chicken shop. And it's good chicken, if you eat chicken. And my job was to come up with some really funny puns around chickens and birds, and it was really fun. Clucky birds, tasty birds, lovingly reared, the good life. I had a real ball with this one, and my words were for these posters that you'll see on the walls inside the shop, and I just had to fit into a sort of creative campaign, really. So yeah, that was recent and fun.
And then finally, this was these guys are the guy. This is the company called Leland Music, and they're the guys who come up with the soundtrack that everyone gets giddy about for the John Lewis Christmas ad every year, and the Daily Mail gets all excited. And they create bespoke tracks for advertising and for film scores. And they will find new creative new musicians to work with, but they'll also work with well-known musicians and get them to do something entirely different. And they kind of live and breathe music, and the identity is basically all based around language, around adjectives that describe what they do. So Leland Music, they talk music, discover music, design music, deliver music, and it's this constantly changing identity. And then with music, you've got this amazing selection of either lyrics or quotes that the likes of Frank Zappa or Barry White have said. So the actual copywriting wasn't, a lot of it actually wasn't writing, it was actually finding things that were out there rather than necessarily writing things from scratch.
We thought we'd put together some top tips about how a good project can come together when the two marry really well, when the words and the pictures marry really well. So work with writers who love and understand design. They may not entirely understand it, but to love it, to appreciate it, I think is a really good beginning for a project.
I think also if you can work with a writer who has got a background in design, I think it's a bit like a photographer. Sometimes people will say, I know a man with a camera, he can take a photograph, but I think you need to be able to understand the kind of photograph that you want to take rather than just having somebody who can just point a camera and just capture it. It's about having an understanding of what that photograph has to capture, particularly when you're doing it for a particular for a brand and they've got something that you need to communicate. Work with designers who love and understand writing. Designers, some are really lazy and they will, it goes back to lorem ipsum for me is a lorem ipsum headline, or this is a headline, is the laziest thing you can possibly do. The whole, every idea that gets presented should have writing at the centre of it.
Just to add, designers should write. Lots of designers that I lose work for this, so but there are lots of designers who can write really well, and you're one of them actually. And I think that
they can't spell, but
no,
they,
that's
but
true.
they can write.
But the thing is that the concepts and the ideas are all in their head, and if somebody phones you and you work remotely and says, I've got this idea, I'm working up this piece of design, can you have a look at the brief and come up with some copy? That person can probably do it as well as me. We could work together. And it seems silly to break that chain.
Well, there has to be a starting point for a copywriter to then run with the idea. If you just give them a picture with something saying this is a headline on it, you've really not, that isn't a starting point for a copywriter to ever actually do their job properly.
So know your audience. We've already talked about this and the importance of knowing who you're talking to and what you want them to think, feel and do when they interact with your communication.
Think about tone of voice. So think about what you're going to say and also how you're going to say it. So Are you going to say hello or are you going to say hi? All of that has to reflect the brand and goes back to the strategy that was created right at the very beginning.
And I think this is the most important thing. Less is more is used a lot in what I do, and it's not always right. Maggie said to me, less is not more, when I was working with the charity. But I think keeping it simple within design is really important, because people are, I've said it several times, we are bombarded with content through every social media app, constantly, every minute of every day. People are vying for our attention, and so simplicity is really powerful in this hectic, crazy landscape of too much information. I'm often asked to work with lawyers, pharmaceutical companies, people who are trained to be complicated, people who are inherently complex in how they communicate and find it really difficult to edit and to be precise. And it's all in the edit. It's all down to what you say and what you don't say.
A prime case of that would be Mr. Trump, who has definitely kept it simple.
Nice and simple.
And that's us.